What's up, everyone? We're so excited for our next session of Green Jobs Pavilion 2025, where we are going to talk about how to get your climate work funded. I'm so excited that we get to be joined by the amazing team at the Carmack Collective, who's going to go over the funding landscape and advice on things like applying to grants, thinking about where you could get your climate work funded, and the best types of industries to tap into. So I'll leave the floor to them. This is going to be an interactive Q&A, so have your questions ready. I know I'm going to be participating in the audience too, and let's get started.
Amazing. Thank you, Chrissy. Just to give you a little bit more information kind of on the format that we'll do today, we'll do a little bit of introduction of the three of us just chatting about how we all got into the climate justice movement. We'll give just a few stats. We don't want to be too stat heavy. We don't want to be preaching to the choir on this, but a few stats on the climate funding landscape. We'll give a few pieces of large kind of broad advice, and then we want to leave the majority of the time for a really robust Q&A session so you can ask us your questions. We will hopefully have the answers to those. But actually, do we want to maybe, Michél, start with you in an introduction and tell the folks who you are and how you got here?
Hey everyone, my name's Michél. I use he, him pronouns. I'm based in Brooklyn, New York. My full-time job is that I'm a campaigns director at Dogwood Alliance. And then I've been honored to be part of the advisory committee, which is the folks that are in the movement that are supporting the granting work of Carmack Collective. Are we sharing like the full? Yeah. So I started kind of as someone who grew up like low income. I was in college and was just like, I don't like the way that the world impacts me. And I also don't think that other people should be, limited by their food access or whatever else. And so I didn't start off as like a social justice like activist. I just started off as someone who cared about the world. And through that, eventually ended up like working at Corporate Accountability, which is an organization that focuses on transnational corporations and how they drive inequity. And I worked in every position in that organization. I was in development. I was a campaigner by the time I left. I'm now on the board. And it was a real culture of like fundraising. And so I think through that, I got fundraising skills way earlier than a lot of people in our movement do. I was supported by a team of fundraisers who were working on foundations fundraising, individual fundraising. 85% of our funding came from individuals and monthly donors. And so I got like a very unique positionality to like raising the resources for our work. And eventually through that, I ended up doing a lot of like participatory grant making processes in the New England area and the Northeast. And that has been like really joy filled and eventually led me to supporting and doing a lot of the participation through the grant making model of Carmack Collective, which I think aligns with my values of putting power into the hands of the people in the movement to identify fundable work that is driven by impacts, but also is driven by trust and relationships. And so, yeah, it's a little bit more about me.
Yeah, thank you, Michél. Jessie, do you want to introduce yourself and introduce the Carmack Collective and what we do?
I absolutely do. Can everyone hear me? Okay, I panicked. I'm Jessie Bluedorn. I'm the founder and executive director of the Carmack Collective. I now realize we have neglected to tell you what the Carmack Collective is, so I'm going to do that now. The Carmack Collective is a $10 million family redistributive fund focused on change work that seeks to combat and dismantle fuel free, see as the largest obstacle to a climate just future. A very small goal. To kind of tell you about the creation of the collective, I'm going to go back in time a little bit. So in 2016, I graduated from college. I moved to New York to start my adult life. Also a very transformative political year with the first election of Donald Trump. On the personal front, I was starting to learn that I was set to inherit a lot of money and didn't know like what that meant for me as a person and how it fit into how I wanted to exist in the world. And so I started to find home in political organizing spaces, specifically climate movement spaces like the Sunrise Movement and 350.org. And I also started to do a lot of donor organizing with funding groups like Resource Generation, Women Donors Network. And all of this sort of came together to then by 2021 lead to the desire to codify and expand the funding work that I was doing in the climate movement. And so we developed the Carmack Collective. Just to tell you a little bit more about our grant-making practices, we are a participatory funder and a trust-based funder. So that means that we try to have low application requirements. We don't require a ton of reporting. We all have been organizers in our lives, so we know that the best use of your time is not filling out a 100-page report that maybe no one's going to read. And so we try to incorporate that. And then just to nod to the advisory board, that's a board of 4 movement leaders from across the climate and narrative movements. And we have a flow fund, so that's a pool of our annual grant-making budget each year that our movement leaders completely grant, dictate where it goes. We think, Ricky and I, who run the collective, think that we're pretty in touch with the movement, but it's not possible to be as in touch with the movement as leaders who are literally on the front lines doing this work every day. And that's really important to us. That was a lot. I'm going to let Ricky go.
Thanks, Jessie. Thanks, Michél. As Jessie said, I lead the collective with Jessie, and my background really starts not too dissimilarly from Michel's. Right, I grew up pretty low income, and that put me into a lot of spaces where I felt like I was like fighting for basic needs for myself, for my peers, for my family, and that brought me, when I was at university, into some movement building groups, and I saw that like, wait, it's just not me that's struggling to like fight for funding and figure that out. This is like a real issue. And so I really kind of took a different approach to that movement building side of things. And I got into the funding side pretty early and figured like, if I could get into the system, can I change the system from within? And I like to believe that we're that we're doing that. And the Carmack Collective really feels like a manifestation of that work. Like Jessie said, very participatory, very low barrier, trying to make the focus of the climate justice work the actual work and not the filling out a form that only the funder wants. Right? Like that's not at all what we want to do. We're going to kind of move into some stats real quick, just like 3 or 4. Again, we're not going to like give you a presentation on that. We just wanted to kind of like set the scene. Again, these are stats that you maybe already know, but we wanted to share those with you anyway. And so less than 2% of global philanthropy goes to climate, which is only about $9 to $15 billion out of the total $885 billion. That's the stat from 2023. I also like want to note that like $9 to $15 billion is a very large sum of money. In the grand scheme of things, it is a very not large sum of money. And so sometimes like this innumeracy can kick in and be like, I can never imagine what $9 billion looks like. It's not enough. I mean, to put it very squarely, many other funders will be like, oh, but you're getting $9 billion. And it's like, great. What about the other $878 billion that's out there? So just, not letting that innumeracy kick in there. Only 3% of climate funding from major U.S. foundations reaches grassroots climate justice groups. I'm going to say that again. Only 3% of climate funding. So that what is that? 2% of global philanthropy. Only 3% of that 2% reaches grassroots climate groups. A very tiny portion of that. And then the last stat that I'll give you all is that we're seeing a trend amongst funders to be more interested in funding narrative work, in storytelling, and culture shifting. That's not to say that there's like been a huge influx of money, but when we talk to other peer funders about what are they interested in funding, it's stories that connect. And so that just wanted to leave you with that, not to paint the picture of like there's a bunch more money flooding in, but as you're positioning your work, thinking about like how do you position it and storytelling for that funder in particular, and which may be different than how you present it to this funder. And that's not to say, thank you, thanks, Michél. That's not to say that you need to like shift your mission to do that. It's just kind of how do you describe your mission to be relevant to that funder. That's all the stats that we're gonna chat through right now. I think maybe Michél, Jessie will move into some of the like positioning strategies piece, and if there's anything that either of you want to share in terms of like thinking about from the movement side of things, if you were approaching a funder, what might entice that funder to look at your work and to fund your work.
Yeah, I'm also going to be reading from a piece of paper, but one is to craft justice-oriented narrative. Don't just cite the data, use stories that humanize the impacts and show solutions, and center frontline voices and lived experience. We're starting to see a trend away from this after like a really big push over the past couple of years, but I think most importantly is to maintain consistency as a movement, that is actually what's most important. And I say that because as a movement organizer, when we are all doing things differently, it forces philanthropy to also move a little bit differently. So I think in one sense, it's a way to be in solidarity with the right move and where we want to be going. And it's also a way to make sure that for those philanthropic vehicles that stories and impact really matter to them, that's one way to really appeal to funders right now. I think the second thing is build trust-based relationships, emphasize partnership and collective impact, not just being a grantee. Highlight need for multi-year flexible support. And that only happens if you know who your program officer is. It only happens if you have a coffee or two. If you're around in the area and you're already doing other organizing activities, take some time to reach out to some funders. A lot of folks believe that their relationship with their funders begins and ends with the form that they submit and the report that they send back. It does not. You can do more. And there are some funders that try to keep a really big wall up between them and the grantees. Some of them many times cite equity as the reason, but there's a lot of them that are actually also very open to meeting and knowing what are your needs? We are only going to fund you for 3 years. That's our stipulation. How can we make sure that you have bridge granting in that 3rd year? How do we get you in front of some other funders? And building that through relationships is a really important way. The last one I'll mention, and then I'll pass it to you, Jessie, is framing through co-benefits. Connect climate to health, education, jobs, racial justice, or resilience. Translate your work into entry points that resonate with funders' broader priorities. And don't force yourself to fit into that work. That's a problem that we see a lot. But make sure that you're connecting the dots in the way that your work is represented. And Ricky was saying, 2% of global philanthropy goes towards climate work. That means that it's less percentage for things that are racial justice and climate, but it's another way to carve out your stake in the impact, right? And to be positioned as a fundable piece of work that matters.
Yeah, but I would add something onto that on the co-benefits piece. And we were actually just chatting about a large funder that I won't specifically name right now, but who we approached them to just chat about climate funding. And they're we don't actually fund any climate work. And then we were looking at some of their grantees, and they're funding climate work that is also arts work. And so in their mind, they're not funding climate work, they're funding arts work. And it's just it's a yes and moment. So I would also encourage you to not just look at the grant making priorities that are listed on a website, but to actually look at the grantees of the funder and see where you can kind of get in and position and use their language that they're using internally to position your work, because it might just be a language barrier, right? They might be using certain terms or certain phrasing that makes them think they're not doing this work, and you can really point to them and be oh, our work is very similar or kind of fits into the same realm as these grantees. That takes a little bit of extra legwork, but grantees are listed; they have to be, right? So I would add onto that.
Great. I'm going to share one more recommendation, and then we're going to go into a Q&A. So if you have any specific questions about your work or how this applies, we'll make this a little more interactive. So the last thing we'll say is funders do historically like to see statistics. We know as movement organizers, as cultural strategists, data isn't always readily available, and it's a lot of work to pull it. So I would say don't hesitate to use existing research from other allies. The broader ecosystem is your friend. You know who else is doing work out there. Numbers on a page do help, but don't feel so much pressure to generate them yourself. Do use them, again, but lean into the broader ecosystem, see how you can be sharing work and case studies with allies and pooling efforts together when you go out to funders. Q&A?
Yeah, Q&A.
Thank you so much for this great panel. My name is Abby. I graduated from City College of New York, and my question was the papers that you guys have been reading from, is there anywhere that we can access those type of resources, or can you make them shareable?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
That's a fantastic question. This is a document that we have just been pulling kind of together very informally. We do have plans to kind of formalize it and make it a dynamic document, so it'll keep growing. And that will be, we communicate mostly with the public via postings on our website that we will then share out on LinkedIn. And so the easiest way to find that would be to, a shameless plug, follow us on LinkedIn, and that's what we'll post them. Yeah, thank you.
ClimateWorks, the large climate funder, publishes one of the most famous reports. That's where that 2% number is usually pulled from. So if you head to the ClimateWorks website, you can get that report off of that.
Thank you. This has been great. So in the last year, I've been thinking about this idea of a multi-integrated app, and I'm coming at this from the creative lens, not technical.
And one of the big things to make it successful is to find funders. And I don't know where to start. I feel kind of like lost in the sense that I don't have the technical side. So I just don't like know where to begin. And I don't know if you could advise anything in direction.
I have a follow-up question. What is the focus of the app?
So the focus of the app is to look at the immediate psychological support and health of an individual that is facing an immediate natural disaster or climate disaster. This idea originally started when I was in college, looking at natural disasters, specifically the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear meltdown that was caused by the tsunami. So looking at ways in which how to support people in those immediate needs right when a disaster is happening immediately before they can be supported long term.
I'll just say something quick, which is funders, to the previous recommendation, tend to categorize by issue area. So I think based on what I'm hearing here, this is disaster resiliency, this is adaptation, this is public health. So you can start to literally Google it, like public health funders, who's funding climate mental health, that kind of thing, and start to drill down. The other good advice we often tell people is who else is doing this type of work, find out who's funding them, and then back research that way to reach out to their funder list.
Yeah, and I think there is also an opportunity to look outside of traditional philanthropy for something, especially tech-based. Venture capitalism is really always kind of keen to look into founders and into innovative programs and platforms like this, and then they often will have connections to the technical side of things as well. And I would say also maybe doing some research on that of like, can you partner with another organization or individual who has that technical side? They might also bring their network into it as well. Some funders maybe will want to see the technical expertise there before they're interested in funding. Some will want to maybe seed fund so that you can go out and find that technical side. So it really is, I think I would look at the larger ecosystem and, like Jessie said, the issue area experts, but then also maybe outside of traditional philanthropy for venture capital as well.
Nice to meet you guys. My question was, I don't know how much of this you do at the Carmack Collective specifically, but if any of you have advice on how to translate that kind of like funding and grant writing process, all of that into like the academia world and how to phrase that side of things, happy to hear it.
Translate to academics for funding from academia, or like what?
Like, I guess I just don't really know how any of the process works. So like when it comes to academia or like compared to funding this, like more grassroots, like nonprofit type of work, like how does that differ? Do you have any advice on like how one might translate to the other?
Are you an academic?
I'm a student. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, so I teach at the higher education level, at the university level, and most like research that comes from that, usually universities will have grant programs, right? But largely outside of that, the work that universities are doing is grant-funded work. So it's usually grants into the university. I would say from my experience, unless you're in a program or you're like in a sponsored program within a university, they usually don't have the resources allocated. They don't have the resources allocated. Very important nuance there to fund this type of work. Unfortunately, the most successful pieces that I've seen have been like joint and like collaborative projects that bring universities in as a collaborative. Universities, like any other organization, like any other person, really like to see their names on things. And so I have seen large success with kind of offering to university like a naming opportunity of like, this is the project funded by or presented by X university. Unfortunately, sometimes you have to like play the game a little bit, especially like universities are massive institutions, and so you have to kind of play their game a little bit to get them on board.
The other thing that I would include around that partnerships piece is that with the the clawing back of like federal funding for a lot of academia, the other things that I've seen motivate and kind of move, maybe more specifically here in New York, has been city funding, state funding in collaboration with higher ed and in collaboration with an organization that's dispersing whatever the technology, the research, the idea is. And so I think looking at maybe, is there organizations that are already partnering with your institution? Is there city level or state level funding that has been mobilizing around legislation that recently passed. Like those kinds of things might be another way in. But yeah, basically what Ricky said.
Thank you so much. I love your panel where you say follow the money, right? That's great. So I have a question on I provide HR and training services for small and medium-sized mission-oriented organizations. So what are the specific capacity building needs that you see in these organizations? This is for the organizations themselves.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind on the capacity building side of things is often organizations are a little timid in investing in their development side, into their fundraising. It takes money to raise money, and that's not like the sexy thing that funders often want to fund, right? They don't want to fund overhead. And I'm putting it in quotes because we all know that like there are people doing this work and they need to be funded. From my experience, especially with small and mid-sized organizations, it's really, and Michél kind of mentioned this with corporate accountability, it's an investment in the individual giving side of things. And I think many organizations are trying to go after like the big dollar amounts from foundations and don't have the capacity to go after those smaller, more consistent individual contributions.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, I should have clarified. When I mean capacity building, I meant the OD, the organization development and strengthening of the staff of these organizations, the HR and OD systems.
Yeah, can I add something to that?
Yes.
One thing is like change management is definitely not something that has been characterized very well amongst organizations, especially ones that are trying to figure out how to diversify funding flows, how to move from being like institutional funded to individual funded. And then they do a terrible job transitioning, from something that they've been doing really, really well. And then they kind of collapse in on themselves because their limited capacity is now being split amongst two different funding streams. And they didn't plan it out in a way that accounts for the time that it needs to change and the trainings that need to go into that. And then I think the other thing is like budgeting. A lot of organizations are very, very bad at budgeting, to be really honest, especially like newer organizations, especially organizations that are trying to like figure out where they fit and they're like early on in their, development. Investing in budgeting is like a really important and critical nature of fundraising because you need to know what you need money for to go out and share that. And if you don't have a budget plan, a lot of funders are going to look at you and be like, well, you're asking for $250,000. Your entire organization runs off of $200,000. You're asking us to be the sole funder. Like, we're never going to do that. And so you've already just like bitten off more than you can chew. You put out a number that doesn't seem realistic. And you may have put off a funder who thinks that like you just came up with a bad plan. So I think budgeting and then also change management at that organizational level.
Great, thank you. My follow-on question is, what is your advice on how to provide support to these organizations? How to get, do funders support this? Because it does impact the mission ultimately.
Yeah, there are some funders that will do what's called technical assistance funding that is really for capacity building. Often they'll say that they really only want to fund like strategic planning. I think that this could be, if needed, you could call this strategic planning. It's not the same like proper like formal strategic plan. So again, it's maybe that like using the funders' terminology and language to do that. And then I think, there are some like kind of like trade groups, right? There are some intermediaries that will fund some of this capacity building. There are some like philanthropy serving organizations, some PSOs that will also fund this. Typically, many large foundations are, like just mentioned earlier, like very program specific. And so it's kind of the process like weeding out which ones will do this or which ones won't do this and details that way.
Anything that comes top of mind?
When you mean anything?
Any funder that comes top of mind who does capacity building or technical assistance?
I don't have a specific name to give you, but I would say that the terminology to look for is look for funders doing technical assistance and look for funders providing general operating support. That's sort of the industry term for funding overhead, capacity building, infrastructural work, as opposed to just direct field efforts.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries. And then just to add, like, I think some other things that may not have come up in that question that might be good for folks to look into is like leadership transition funding. There's a Cricket Island Foundation. I think that's one of their main focuses. There's also like looking at who your grantee partners are, and sometimes they will do specific funding for grantees. Their technical assistance funding. So like Ford Foundation and I think Rockefeller at one point used to do like this other like integral insider kind of like for grantees funding. So
perfect. Thank you.
one more question. And this person right here. Yes, thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I work in the climate sector right now with a lot of grassroots organizations. And so something that's happening is that a lot of foundations are actually pulling back their funding or saying that they're shifting priorities. And so a lot of groups on the ground are really struggling or are looking at massive gaps in their funding. Do you have suggestions for how organizations can go about trying to fill those gaps? I know Michél kind of mentioned individual funding, but then a lot of groups don't make that transition well. So do you have any advice or thoughts on what organizations can do with that? And then also on the point of bridge funding, are there thoughts on how organizations can approach their funders who have said that they will be pulling back funding to have that conversation about bridge funding?
Getting creative. Like grassroots organizations are really good at getting creative. They've, survived different levels of like strains from different eras of like philanthropy going up and down. So I think being creative and leaning into exploring, like, what does it look like to be in solidarity with one another? How do you come together as a group of grassroots organizations, remove the scarcity, and think like abundantly? What if we went and pursued what we need for our overhead together? And we just got a pool of funding that is from a group of funders and they're pitched on that. So I would say getting really creative. And then I think just going and talking to your funders if you need bridge funding. Like I think opening up the conversation, I think a lot of people just neglect that that's an option for them.
I would say just overall, to build on that, finding your champions, both in terms of individuals and organizationally. I feel like you spoke to the foundation part, but the easiest way to get into individual funding is find someone in your network, have them host a house party, have them send out an email to their friends. Who do you already have in your network who would be happy to do more? Maybe it's a board member, a volunteer. I think that we often underemphasize the champions we already have in our midst who maybe they can't bring in $1 million. That's okay. If each person, brought in $1,000, that goes a long way and it's a chain effect.
Kind of building off both of these of like, don't be scared of your funders. I think funders are often seen as like, for very legitimate reasons, seen as like being in this ivory tower, very unapproachable. From my experience, maybe the foundation itself is that, like if it's a tiny institutional philanthropy, but there are people, right? There are staff in that foundation who are doing that work because they care and because they believe in the work that's being funded. And so really approaching program officers and to ask for that bridge funding as individuals, right? Like as people, and like, yes, they're inside a larger system, but like they are just people at the end of the day. I would also say something, and this is less, this is more on the planning side and less on the immediate response side, is a lot of organizations don't understand that they can build a reserve if they receive general operating support, or if the funding is restricted. For this purpose, you can build a hefty savings account that can then be invested in a really secure way to create a sort of rainy day fund. I'm on the board of a local nonprofit in Michigan, and the operating budget for that organization is like $900,000, and there's like $1.5 million in their reserve. So they could operate for more than a year and a half. Based on just what's in their savings account. And that has taken 25 years to get there, right? I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but the founders of the organization were really focused on making sure that the organization was sustainable. And that's something that I think organizations don't understand that they can do. Now, you can't always do that with restricted funding, but that general operating support that Jessie mentioned, sometimes restricted program efforts will have administrative costs in there, a portion that can go into a reserve fund. So that's more on the planning and strategy side of things rather than the immediate response. But I think it's a really good option. Okay, and I think we are at time. Thank you all for joining us today. This has been a lovely conversation. Thank you.